Well, greetings and welcome. Welcome to Healing Worship in an Age of Anxiety with Dr. Michael Jordan. I'm so excited about today's webinar. We've had a lot of interest, a lot of excitement about this, and it's a very interesting topic at a very opportune time. Today's webinar is part of the Wesley Seminary Webinar Series with the goal of resourcing the local church. So we're very excited that you're here with us, those watching it live and those that will be watching the recording. We hope that you find this information very helpful. Now, should you have questions about seminary, you feel like God's putting it on your heart and you just want to talk to somebody, give us a call, 877-673-0009. We'd love to chat with you about that and answer any questions that you might have. Now, during Dr. Jordan's presentation today, should you have any questions, please enter those in the Q&A forum at the bottom of your screen. And we hope that you do enter a question. We hope that you do that. And Dr. Jordan has graciously agreed to answer as many questions as time allows for today after his presentation. So Reverend Dr. Michael Jordan is an ordained Wesleyan pastor with 11 years of pastoral ministry experience in United Methodist, American Baptist, and Wesleyan churches. From 2002 until 2009, he was the pastor of Exton Community Baptist Church in Exton, Pennsylvania, and also served on the pastoral staff of his current church, Houghton Wesleyan. Now, Mike's wife, Jill, is a mathematician who also teaches at Houghton. They live just off campus and together are raising their 5 children, Grace, Jack, Lucy, Gabriel, and Anne. Now, Dr. Jordan received his bachelor's degree from Houghton College, his MDiv from Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and his PhD in liturgical studies from Drew University. Now, in his spare time, Dr. Jordan enjoys singing, crossword puzzles, and distance running, and he is a rabid fan of Philadelphia professional and college sports. So, Dr. Jordan, I have 2 questions for you after reading through your bio.
All right.
Okay, now I see that you enjoy singing, so I won't ask you to sing unless you want to.
No, that's all right.
Feel free to, it's your forum.
All right.
First question, it says crossword puzzles.
Yes.
So I got to ask you, do you do Wordle?
I do Wordle, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Yep, love Wordle. So,
Awesome.
Yep.
Awesome.
Yep.
Great. All right, I thought you might. And then second question, being a rabid fan of Philadelphia professional and college sports, so how far do you have Villanova going in your bracket?
I had Villanova winning it, so
Okay.
It's not looking optimistic, but it's better than it is for 64 other teams right now. So we're happy to be as far along as we are. We'll see how it goes, but yeah.
Much better than my dear Hoosiers are faring right now.
Sorry, yeah.
That's all right. Well, thank you so much for your time, sir. Can't wait to hear what you have to share with us.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I'm really glad to be here with everybody. My role at Houghton is Dean of the Chapel, so that's a little bit like campus pastor. So if you're kind of wondering where I fit in, it's partially some teaching and partially pastoral work. The picture that's up there that was used to advertise, I always feel like for these pictures, I can never quite, every time I get a picture taken, it's sort of like I try to imagine, is this how normal people smile? So my apologies, my apologies for the photograph. Thanks for coming anyway. The book I want to share with you a bit about is a book that I am writing, hoping to publish in a couple of years. I have a publisher I'm working with, InterVarsity Press Academic. And it was really born out of a desire to recognize the complexity that many of my students were bringing to college. So I don't know what you were like when you were in college. I know I'm probably talking to people who really span the age gap. For me, when I went to college, I graduated in 1999, I was really unaware of my inner life. I certainly was a committed Christian, but I didn't really have a sense for anything really related to mental health or anything like that. Compared to that, I am stunned at the capacity young people have today to talk about what's going on inside of them. You know, I sit with enough young people today who, one young man in particular just sticks out to me, who just recounted kind of, well, you know, I went through this traumatic episode and this traumatic episode when I was younger. And so because of that, these are some ways that I struggle to feel comfortable in large group situations, those kinds of things. That was just beyond me when I was 18 or 19. What has convicted me, though, was the way that those narratives about what was going on inside of them didn't always connect easily with their faith. And there's some reasons for that, and we're going to talk about a few of them here. But it's to me really interesting that Houghton is full of committed Christian young people who are also very aware of their mental health, and you haven't quite yet made the connection between how mental health and their Christian faith connect. And so, these are things I had been ruminating on for a while, and then I happened to get in a conversation with an editor from this series who's working. The series with IVP is called Dynamics of Christian Worship. And so it's aimed at kind of partway between pastoral and academic. And so we had a conversation, and we thought this was a good idea for what might make a good book. So we will see how it goes. I'm pretty early in the writing process, so all these thoughts may look a little bit different by the time it reaches bookstores and no doubt your shelves in early 2024. That's the hope anyway. So the book will be titled, at least the working title is Healing Worship in an Age of Anxiety. And I want to be really clear here right up front. Part of what we're struggling with in the title is we don't want to give the impression that worship cures anxiety or eliminates anxiety. So if that's part of what you're hearing, if that's part of what you're concerned about, just take it off your radar. The goal is not to talk about worship as eliminating anxiety or anxious feelings, but that worship could be a healing space for people who experience anxiety. What is it that currently a person might go to church and if they're experiencing anxiety, might feel unsettled, might feel unseen, might feel unloved? What could we do to make worship a healing space where people with anxiety feel at home and welcome, and that we are walking with them on a journey of healing that they're experiencing in their own life as they learn to reduce and or learn to live with their anxious feelings. So that's where we'll go today. And like I say, feel free to ask questions. If there are things we don't have time for, if you want me to reach out to you later, feel free to shoot me an email, michael.jordan@houghton.edu, and I'd be glad to talk with you more about it along the way. So first, just a kind of basic starting point. What's anxiety? From the APA, anxiety is an emotion, sorry, I'm blocking myself here, an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. People with anxiety disorders usually have recurring intrusive thoughts or concerns. They may avoid certain situations out of worry. They may also have physical symptoms such as sweating, trembling, dizziness, or a rapid heartbeat. And there are definitions of anxiety all around. It seemed as good as any to start where the APA starts. So just to note here, there's a difference between anxiety and anxiety disorders. Increasingly, mental health professionals feel like anxiety is a normal part of life in some ways. It's hard to live in an age when nuclear war is being talked about again as a possibility and not feel a little anxious about that. If you didn't register any emotional feeling about that, we'd be concerned. We'd be concerned that you weren't anxious enough, that this reality hadn't quite sunk into you. And likewise, anxiety is not on its own a bad thing. It's just a feeling that people have. But there is a way in which anxiety can spiral out of control in our lives. And you can see some physical symptoms related to it there. If that's where we find ourselves, that's problematic. So when we ask what's wrong with anxiety, like I say, it's not always a bad thing. If you think about a sensation like physical pain, for instance, we know that physical pain serves a purpose in our lives. And if we didn't feel physical pain, we might do things that injure us, but physical pain sort of warns us against doing this thing that we're doing and says, stop doing it. And anxiety can kind of function in the same way. But it becomes problematic when, again, those physical symptoms that we saw before, the sweating, the dizziness, those sorts of things. A few more things, though, can make anxiety really more problematic. When recurring anxious feelings interfere with our ability to function. If I can't do the things I need to do or do the things I want to do because I'm worried, because I'm uneasy, that's problematic. It's keeping me from being the person that otherwise I could be. And from a Christian perspective, it's keeping us from being the people that God has made us to be. When we're unable to encounter the world as it is, if we need to walk through the world sort of functionally not telling the truth about it to ourselves, that's also problematic. If we can't sort of acknowledge, for example, as I was talking about before, when we think about the situation in Ukraine, right? The situation in Ukraine is happening. If I have to live my life functionally as if it's not happening. If I sort of say, I have to pretend that's not real in order for me to exist long-term, that's problematic. No, I shouldn't be hyper-focused on it. Yes, it's way out of my control. But I also sort of have to acknowledge it's part of the world. Life is awfully contingent in lots of ways. And so being able to acknowledge that is an important part of just being honest about the world that we live in. When we find ourselves making decisions inconsistent with our values, if we find ourselves acting in ways that we're not proud of because we're afraid to do anything else, this is problematic. Those of you who are pastors, if you feel like, for example, concern about what your people will say about you is keeping you from expressing something that you believe is at the heart of the gospel, this is problematic. Again, not that you need to say everything that's on your mind all the time, but if you find yourself consistently living in ways that's not consistent with who God's made you to be or how you understand the world to be, that's a problem. And we need to deal with whatever unease or worry is keeping us from doing it. Finally, and this is something that I hope that you can resonate with, it's certainly something I see in working with young people, when we're anxious about our anxiety. Many of us realize that the experience of anxiety, when we have it, it will be a problem if we share it. And for me, this is really crucial in thinking about the church dynamic here, right? Because if we take statistics seriously, that whatever, it's somewhere between a sixth and a fifth of people experience kind of an unacceptable level of anxiety in a year in America, then we're talking about a sixth to a fifth of our churches, 1 out of every 6 or 1 out of every 5 people who are feeling like they can't be honest about this thing that's going on inside of them, because if they are, it will be too hard for the church in which they're in. And largely they would experience it like this, to feel like if I'm clear about my anxiety, there may be a way that someone talks to me at church about it that makes me feel such intense shame, or might make me feel like I'm such a burden to the church that I'll be sorry that I said it in the first place. And that's a lot to ask people to carry around. I mean, it's certainly not consistent with the gospel to sort of say, come to Jesus as you are, keep that part of you hidden because it's too hard for all of us to deal with. But so there's a great deal of kind of meta anxiety in the world. People who know that their anxiety is inconvenient to their churches, to their families, to their workplaces. And so they feel like, not only am I feeling anxious, but I've got to keep it hidden. And that's part of why I really started by saying, this is not about eliminating anxiety, right? When we hold that up as a goal for people, that's just not a healthy place to be. And it makes us anxious to eliminate that feeling altogether. So let's talk about some current treatment for anxiety, right? Historically, mental health professionals have sought to eliminate anxious feelings. So when you're feeling anxiety, the goal was to get rid of anxiety altogether. And again, that kind of meta anxiety I talked about before is what makes it really, really, that's really problematic, right? I mean, it's hard to make yourself not feel something. If I say, don't be anxious, even if you weren't thinking about it before, you might be now. And so that reality is a little bit late 20th century. So currently there's an understanding that some level of anxiety or arousal is essential for us to function. Like, I was talking to a professor here at Houghton about it, and she said, yeah, like some anxiety is the reason that we get out of bed in the morning, right? We have a sense of there's something that needs to be done. It depends on me to do it. And that's not entirely a positive feeling. Like there are some ways in which that's positive. I'm needed, I'm valued. My family and my workplace and my community need my gifts. But there's a little bit of anxiety that sort of says, today I'd just like to be. I'd like to stay in bed sometimes. And so, we need that kind of the sense of something has got to move us in order to function. And that itself has kind of mixed feelings attached to it. So most modern treatments don't focus on eliminating or pathologizing anxious feelings, but on these, helping people manage their anxious feelings, just sort of acknowledge those anxious feelings are there. What are you going to do with them? How are you going to go forward? Helping people make decisions to act in ways consistent with their values instead of acting out of anxiety, right? So to be able to sort of say, despite the fact I'm feeling anxious, I'm able to understand what's really going on here. I acknowledge my anxious feeling. I'm not going to try to get rid of it, but I am going to try to live in a way that's consistent with what I know to be most real now. As opposed to, I'm going to let anxiety sort of take over, lie to me about the nature of things, and choose my course of action for me. One example of this, and I'm not sure this may be the way the book settles, or I may choose to kind of talk about this and some other types of therapy. But one is called ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. And the 6 main focuses or foci of this are: 1, acceptance. Don't run from or try to eliminate anxious feelings. Feel them fully and without defense. In other words, those who practice this sort of realize, when I'm feeling anxious, I have these kind of elaborate defense mechanisms I use to deflect the anxiety away, to not acknowledge that it's there, and instead saying, I can look it straight in the face, as it were, and say, oh, okay, that's anxiety, that's there, I feel it, as opposed to trying to deflect it or minimize it. Cognitive diffusion, understanding that your thoughts are just thoughts and not reality itself. And so sometimes this can even take the form of like talking out loud about the thing that you're experiencing in your mind until the words sort of start to lose their meaning, because you just have talked about it enough that you realize, oh, these ideas are just not real. Once I've said it aloud enough, I realize that this is not as real as it was when it was living in my head. Being present, open yourself to the reality around you. So much anxiety lives in this place that unsettles us and keeps us either in the past or in the future. Anxiety makes us concerned about something we did a long time ago that we worry is overwhelming people's opinion of us, or it takes us into something that we haven't yet faced. Instead of saying, there's a present, there's a place and a time that I find myself in by the grace of God, I'm glad to be here, and I open myself to the reality of all that is in this moment for me. I look at its challenges, I look at its gifts, I can define what's in front of me with clarity. Self as context. Remember that you are not your thoughts, but that you are a transcendent human being thinking your thoughts. And again, this is a way of kind of owning kind of an appropriate agency, saying, I recognize this is going on in me, but I don't have to act in a way that's accordant with it. I'm beyond my thoughts. I might not be able to master them completely. If I say, don't think of an elephant, you're going to think of an elephant, right? I might not be able to master every thought, but I also don't have to be dominated by them. Again, the last couple here: clarifying values, establish what principles are really worthy of governing your behavior, and then committed action, right? And so an ACT therapist might sort of give homework that gives people practice in acting in ways that are consistent with what they know to be true, rather than what the anxiety is saying. And so this is one way that anxiety is currently treated. Like I say, the book may or may not land here as the way we talk about, but it's roughly emblematic of the ways that people talk about anxiety now, as opposed to trying to eliminate feelings, kind of live within them, recognize appropriate agency of yourself in the midst of experiencing those feelings. Let me just jump over to thinking about the church and mental health. And again, this is going to be much too broad, but just I want to kind of lay out for you a little bit of how this conversation has gone, right? Again, I know that I'm talking to people who run the gamut age-wise. So I'm 44. For my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, certainly, the idea of mental health was something that was essentially understood as a way of describing what's going on inside of you without reference to God. And so Christians were very skeptical of it. And that's still a place that many people are. I don't think I would feel as compelled to write about this topic if I were doing ministry with older adults, because many older Christian adults continue to experience stigmatization around this. And you know, yeah, when I think, for example, about the counseling center that was at Houghton when I was there in the mid-90s as a student, I remember the head of the counseling center had to come to our freshman orientation and just sort of explain, like, this is what the counseling center is for. You know, if you're experiencing this, please come and get counseling, right? And it's almost like, you know, they had been hired as counselors, and yet there was a skeptical enough public that counseling was something that we needed. It just didn't occur. It never would have occurred to me without that I might need to visit a counselor from time to time, because that's just not how I was raised. So that's stage one, right? Stage two, and again, this is starting in the 1960s, and this is not linear. Like, everybody exists somewhere on the way here. Some people are still in stage one, some are in stage two, right? But starting in the 1960s, Christians begin to open up to the idea of mental health and psychology in general. Schools like Houghton and Wheaton and Gordon, and Catholic schools like Notre Dame start psychology majors, they start counseling centers. Fun fact, if you're interested in Henry Nouwen, I'm a huge Henry Nouwen person, and Nouwen started the psychology department at Notre Dame. He was invited to start the psychology department there. So these were sort of things that Christians were beginning to sort of say, okay, there's something here, we need to open up to it. So that today, there doesn't need to be a talk from the head of the counseling center to the freshman orientation. In fact, these days, when this semester, when Houghton opened up its scheduling for our counselors for the semester, within a couple of days, all the available slots had filled up because people, young Christian people, were much more comfortable understanding that they had mental health kinds of needs and that counseling was an acceptable way of dealing with them. I think for me, what's really interesting, and this book I hope is part of it, stage 3 is what's next. We don't want to go back, right? Like most, not all Christians, but most have kind of destigmatized mental illness. But what I think is really interesting is watching them try to struggle with, okay, on the one hand, I talk about Jesus as God, the one who sort of determines the nature of things, determines who I am, that I find my identity in Christ. That phrase, I have my identity in Christ, is a phrase young people are using all the time. And yet they don't seem to understand how this phrase, like my identity in Christ, goes hand in hand with a mental health journey. How do these two things connect? Because when they're describing their mental health journey, often they're doing that entirely without reference to Jesus. They don't seem to recognize that these two things have to find some way of integrating. If you've got this foundational commitment about the nature of things and the nature of your identity, it has to integrate somehow with mental health. There are some concerns, right, among some people when you start talking this way that we want to go back to stage 1 and sort of say, like, let's just get back to praying this away. That is not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is we've got to get past the idea that young people could come to a Christian university and go through a mental health sort of paradigm that would not help them integrate their faith in some way. And our students, like our counselors, try hard to do that, but our students are just not primed for that. And so that shouldn't be normal for us. And I hope that this book is a step in that, a little piece of that discussion as we go forward. When I teach spiritual formation at Houghton, we always have a counselor join us for one session where we talk about, like, what can I do, the counselor, for a person experiencing anxiety, and what can a pastor do for, what are mental health tools and what are spiritual tools, and how do they complement each other? And I hope that this book is a little bit of help in that direction. So I hope we model a third stage in the discussion. When we think about what's going on with the church today in anxiety, we got to recognize anxious people in our congregations, like I say, between 1 and 5 and 1 and 6, right? Churches can be places that reinforce healing or undercut or undermine healing. By that, I mean the things that we just looked at, and we'll pull the slide up again here in a second, but those 6 things that people are trying to do to heal in the middle of their anxiety, those are things that when they come to church, which is the place where this foundational identity piece, this foundational commitment to the very nature of things, right, where this is being proclaimed over here, this can do something to either reinforce the healing that they're finding in other places or undercut it. And so that's what we want to think through, is in what way is our churches, or in what way are our churches doing it? When we think about, particularly about worship, so my background is in liturgical studies, as Joel shared with you. And so worship in America historically has been a place that's actually pretty riddled with anxiety. My dissertation is about Charles Finney. He was a 19th century revival preacher. And for him, he believed that the truth, when it is proclaimed to a regenerate heart, brings joy, but it would bring anxiety to a heart that was far from God. So he would say, basically, if you want to experience joy, you simply have to leave your old ways behind, come to Jesus, and then the truth will make you happy instead of anxious. And that might be an elementary way of understanding it. There may indeed be some truth in it, but that was Finney's idea. Finney's skeptics believed that he was intentionally provoking people to be anxious in order to get them to convert. Now, he did not understand it that way. He had, if you go through his lecture notes from when he taught pastoral ministry, when you go through his, all of his writing, he never consciously sort of tried to raise people's anxiety in order to get them to convert. But he did say, I want to proclaim the truth in as pointed a way as possible, because the purer that I present truth, the more anxious a non-regenerate heart is going to be, and the more likely it is that they'll then want to convert. But that's how he understood it anyway. But a skeptic said, no, you're just making people anxious in order to get them to convert. Now, later evangelists actually did more of this. Moody and Billy Sunday were people who did not have quite the same intellectual acumen that Finney did, and they were more intentional about telling long and scary or sad stories that would unsettle listeners. Moody was rather famous for telling a story about a little boy whose legs got run over by a train, and you know, the person who had brought him to Jesus, the Sunday school teacher who had brought him to Jesus, like, came over after she saw the train run him over, and he asked if he was going to live, and the teacher said no, and the boy said, well, then tell them that I died a Christian. You know, these sorts of stories, which probably had little basis in reality, but they were specifically designed to sort of unsettle listeners and make them more ready to hear what it was that Moody and Sunday would say would be the solution to this, which was, of course, becoming a Christian. So in this era, we find people explicitly and even intentionally using anxiety to move people toward Jesus. And that is something we just need to reckon with. It's not really, I don't say it's not debatable. I'm enough of a historian to know everything's debatable, but this is what happened. And so we need to sort of think it through and think through what we'd like to retain and what we'd like to question from that era. When we look at anxiety in worship today, right, we use explicit anxiety less, but I think anxiety is at work in implicit ways in our worship today. And what do I mean by that? I think one thing that really undergirds a lot of American church practice today is what we call the homogeneous unit principle, which essentially says it's hard to get people to both come to church and come to Jesus and cross generational, gender, race, sociological, socioeconomic barriers. People want to be with other people like them, with the same sorts of interests, with the same sorts of outlook on reality, the same sorts of worldviews. And so it's pretty common practice in the last 50 or 60 years in American church growth strategy to say, you know what, if people don't want to cross those barriers to come to Jesus, we have to give them Jesus in a way that makes them comfortable without all of that interaction. Now, from my perspective, right, I mean, I think that way of thinking has really dug into the American church in pretty profound ways, both for good and ill. But I think one of the things it's done is to kind of reinforce the idea that there is a rivalry between these different groups, right? You don't want, the tacit idea is, you don't want to experience these people who are different than you. And you know what? You shouldn't have to. These people who are different than you, crossing that barrier really would be a really hard thing to do. And of course, the tacit idea there is because those other people really are difficult for you. And so, you know, with the way that we find worship often divided down generational lines, the way we find the church to be segregated racially, these sorts of things, I think reinforce the idea that we're not surrounded by people who necessarily love and care for us, that we're part of a large family, but that we really are part of these demographic groups that consumer America says we're part of, and we are entitled to a church experience that doesn't make us cross those barriers. Well, it's hard not to be anxious if you think of yourself as part of a demographic group surrounded by warring demographic groups. So that's one piece, I think. Even the idea of timeless gospel and time-bound methods, which I think venerates an ever-shifting youth culture. This idea, when we find ourselves not being so young, and when we find ourselves in churches that are no longer catering to us, can also provoke anxiety. Who am I now? That people are not planning around me, that people are not looking for me, looking out for me in the same way. This is a challenging thing churches need to answer. This also, I think, is an important idea, right? There's an expected shape to what it means to meet God. What do I mean by that? It's sort of hard to define, but what it means when you encounter God, for example, in a Hillsong worship service, or a worship service that could be in one of our Wesleyan churches that uses like Hillsong, Bethel, elevation kind of music, those kinds of things. We know that, for example, there's like an emotional component to what it means when the song jumps an octave, right? Or a certain chord progression sort of tells us like, okay, this is the kind of feeling that comes with encountering God. Now, some people sort of naturally gravitate towards those feelings and that particular emotional script that says, when God shows up, this is how it feels to you. Right, but not everybody resonates with those. And as I say here, that shape is inaccessible to all of us sometimes. Right? All of us have days where we're not quite there. And for some people, they're never there. Like, that's just not how they're wired. It doesn't make sense to them to meet God in that way, and to believe that when I meet God, these kinds of feelings ensue. And so that's also something that can cause a lot of anxiety. If I'm surrounded by people who say, this is the way to meet God, ritually rehearsing that this is the way to meet God again and again, that challenges us and says, like, well, maybe there's different ways. Like, maybe it doesn't always mean the same thing when I meet God. Maybe there's a broader sort of scope of shapes of emotional encounters with God. Finally, I think there's also something about worship as spectacle that we need to think about here. If we want people to know that God is at work in the ordinary, be present things in our lives, then worship, I don't know that creating spectacles in worship that sort of remove us from our ordinary life necessarily helps that to happen. And particularly, like I say, it can reinforce a producer-consumer dynamic, right? It says, like, I can go to this church because they regularly create the conditions where I can meet God. And if you've ever been part of a church where people have said to you, either they've said to you, like, I just don't feel like I encountered the Spirit. I just can't worship that way. Or if they said to you something like, well, when I moved, I just never found another church quite like this one. That's problematic. I mean, these aren't things that we should be doing. We can't conjure up God in a way that should be exclusive of the ways that other people might meet God. So these are some thoughts about how implicit anxiety kind of works in worship today in some ways. Now, again, this approach just works against all these things that people learn in other places, right? If, for example, if what you're learning is I need to be present, then if you take on a form of worship which sort of devalues the things that are going on all around you, teaches you close your eyes, focus in on God, that's incongruous, and people sense its incongruity as they're hearing this one thing from their counselor and this one thing from their church. So what we want to think through, and this is again where I'm going to be going in the book, is just thinking through like different practices in worship, different approaches that we're using in specific areas of worship. Say, how could worship be a place that's healing, that comes alongside and helps the conversation to happen in a healthy way? How can worship be a place that doesn't take anxiety away, doesn't magically cure it, but sort of is acting in ways consistent with the healing and the growth that comes from exercising your agency appropriately in the middle of your anxious feelings? Well, one way I have as liturgical time. And if you're not familiar with the phrase liturgical time, I may or may not use it in the book, but this idea of like, how do Christians mark time? Modern evangelical worship sometimes aims at producing an effect of being in a time outside of time. Through an ecstatic moment, we're removed from everything ordinary into an encounter with God in a specific moment, where we're encouraged, again, to sort of close our eyes, don't focus on our neighbor. Again, think about what's encoded in that idea of sort of closing my eyes and not paying attention to my neighbor, right? That sort of reinforces the idea that my neighbor is primarily a threat to my encounter with God, rather than an ally to my encounter with God. So modern evangelical worship sometimes removes us from the things that are around us all the time and sort of says, this is how you meet with God, in a way that's pretty incongruous with everyday life. So this is fine. Like it's true, right? Like I've been moved in worship services like that. And this is part of life, right? Is making sure that we do have these times where we can meet God that are different than the rest of our lives. But it's also not quite complete on its own. If this is the only way you know to meet with God, problematic. So a healing approach to this that I think can help people locate themselves within a specific history that's bigger than them. So part of what, for example, a church that observes the Christian year can do, part of that is it locates us in a big story. And part of what might make us anxious, frankly, is the way that some modern worship kind of focuses in on ourselves and say, what's God doing? What's God telling me? What's God saying to me right now? I need to know that God loves me. Celebrating the liturgical calendar, honoring these things where every year We walk through Advent, we walk through Christmas, we walk through Epiphany, we walk through Lent, we walk through the cross, we walk through the resurrection, we walk through Pentecost, right? We're telling ourselves again and again this big story. Why do I exist as a Christian? To remember who Jesus was so that I can be empowered to extend his ministry into the world by the power of the Holy Spirit. And so because of that, like the liturgical calendar takes on this huge focus of sort of rooting us within this bigger story, instead of making it about how am I perceiving God's touching me or talking to me about this moment. If anxiety can arise when we feel alone and disconnected, the liturgical calendar connects us with something that's much bigger than ourselves. The observance of Sabbath, I think, is an important part of this, right? When I realize that every week there's a day set aside that is not for me and for my agenda, but to simply rest and be with God. That Sabbath is about being and not doing, and that I'm welcome every week and encouraged every week to remember I'm not what I produce. I'm God's, right? That's a crucial idea as well. Finally, stories and days specific to a congregation. One of the things I loved most when I was working in seminary with some African-American churches in Philadelphia was the way that they celebrated their pastor's anniversary. And so there would be this, this day of the year where they acknowledged the pastor that had been there for 12 years with them, and it would often be a time to also remember previous pastors who had been there, and as a way of them telling their story together. And again, it's a way for individual worshipers to get out of themselves and to frankly stop seeing the church as something which is making something for their own personal journeys, and to stop judging the church based on whether or not it's meeting their felt needs at the moment. And instead saying, I'm part of a big family, and this family is big enough to catch me and my anxious feelings when I'm feeling them. So this is a piece on liturgical time. We think about liturgical space, and this is just a way of thinking about church architecture and church decor, the things that surround us as we worship. Just like what we talk about with liturgical time, much modern worship is built around creating kind of an unusual experience, right? Removed from the real world through a totalizing black box theater experience. And what I mean by that, if you don't know about the black box theater kind of idea, but just that what's really important in worship is that we're able to kind of control the lighting. And to control the lighting, we need to be able to, so we paint the walls black, we do whatever we can to sort of reduce natural lighting in favor of having something that's easy for us to control. It creates a rather totalizing experience, of course. It shuts us off from the outside world. When you try to shut us off from natural light, that's hard to do without creating a room that's kind of very densely enclosed. And so to be clear, right, there are echoes of this in medieval cathedrals. They also tried to create alternative worlds almost. It's not like if you were in a medieval cathedral that you would say, oh, this is just like the world around me, right? It also was a totalizing experience, but it was different in some ways. And just some considerations that I think are important as we think through what space do we surround ourselves with is who's setting the agenda for the space, right? Who gets to decide what happens with the lighting? Part of what makes a medieval cathedral different than a black box theater is sort of a sense of there's a theological agenda to what the cathedral is trying to do. The cathedral theological agenda might not be perfect on its own, but it's a different theological agenda than the black box theater experienced. And the other question is, how are people empowered to connect that space with the real world? In other words, what does it mean? What are the things that usher us in and out of church that sort of say, okay, this God that I met in this place I can reasonably expect to encounter this God now that I'm leaving this place and going somewhere else. So for me anyway, the way I want to lean with this is to say a healing approach to liturgical space enables connection with creation and with each other. That when we go into, if part of the goal of what we're learning about mental health is the importance of being present to God, to others, to the world around us, to ourselves, then we have to have spaces that enable that. We have to have spaces that enable people to connect with each other easily. One of the things that's really disorienting to me when I speak, and I know that if I'm talking to pastors, some of you do this regularly, but when I speak and the lights are up on me, but down on the people, right? I often think, in what ways does this resemble human to human communication, right? In what ways does this train people to sort of know that they can look for God in the things that people say to each other? And in what ways does it put a spotlight on me and teach people to not really trust each other around them? So for me, liturgical space needs to enable this kind of connection so that people feel connected to the world around them rather than, I can't go back to the real world, I can only be with God here. And also seeks to evoke the transcendent to enable connection with God. A couple more, and then we'll just turn it over to some Q&A. So some thoughts about music, right? Modern evangelical approaches to music often baptize personal preference, and they reinforce the dividing lines, which keep us from knowing the connection and security of a large family. Part of what I try to do at Houghton is really tell students up front, you are going to encounter worship here, which is strange for you. And I expect that you will feel at home in maybe 1 out of 3 chapel services, but 2 out of 3, you're going to be learning about things that you might just not know much about, and it won't feel like your heart language. And at first you'll say, why am I doing this? Because often we don't feel like churches sort of encourage us to go beyond our personal preference. So I know it's going to feel strange to you at first, I say, but ultimately I say, you want to know that you're part of a family that's bigger than you. And part of that is introducing you to people in the family whose tastes seem bizarre to you. And ultimately that's reassuring, right? It's ultimately reassuring to know that not everybody here is like me, because it also holds open the possibility that other people may have answers to the questions I deeply feel, and that other people might have a different perspectives that can help illumine mine. So a healing approach to music wants to bridge that gap, and that we are intended to experience God within a large and diverse family. A couple thoughts on preaching. I think modern evangelical preaching can often devolve into education, content delivery, moralism, or deeply anxious implicit ways of reinforcing tribal identity. When I go to, what I mean by this is like a sermon that seems to have at its heart saying, isn't it absurd that this is happening in the world, as a way of sort of making everybody say, yeah, that's absurd. I'm tired of the world being that way. I don't want to live in a world like that anymore. Come quickly, Lord Jesus, which, you know, I mean, maybe it's cathartic in the moment, but we need to do more than that to proclaim the full counsel of God for our people. And so for me, a healing approach to preaching really has eyes wide open to people, right? What can be demoralizing if you experience anxiety is for preaching to be one more way that tells you my anxiety is not welcome here. The things that I look at in the world and see problems are absurd or they're problematic. And so for me, often when I talk about preaching, I talk about being utterly faithful to Scripture, utterly faithful to who you are, and utterly faithful to the listeners. And that means really understanding deeply what are the things that motivate them. Not because you agree with all of them, but because you have to trust that God has made a divine appointment between you, this text, and these people. And that there's a word for the Lord that's at the intersection of all those, as long as you're being honest about all 3 of those things and understanding them correctly. But if you fall off the axis on any one of these, it will be hard for the word of the Lord to be proclaimed. Of course, it's always a miracle, so I'm not saying it can't happen, right? But if you have misunderstood the Scripture, if you're found to be wanting in how you understand yourself, or if you don't at all understand your listeners, the word that we speak could be more anxiety reducing than helping people discover, right? Like, as I say here, the goal for me is that the preacher kind of models this journey for people of looking at a text, internalizing its lessons, growing in gratitude, growing in holiness. So listeners have that modeled for them by the preacher, but listeners also have the experience of feeling seen, heard, known, and loved as they are. And when they experience that, they experience the security for them to grow and for them to develop as well. Last thing, and then we'll, again, jump into some Q&A. Sacraments, I think, are part of this too. So in the Wesleyan tradition, again, I know not all of you are Wesleyans who are listening, but we are a sacramental church. But at times I hear Wesleyans talking about sacraments as if in the sacrament of baptism, we often talk about it as if it was primarily a personal testimony, a way of me bearing witness to people about what God has done in my life. I often hear communion or the Eucharist talked about kind of as an object lesson, a way that God sort of teaches us an idea. But in a sacramental church like the Wesleyan Church, sacraments are objective ways to pointing to something outside of ourselves and outside of our own feelings and our own intellect. And again, I don't say that to be just a sacramental snob. I feel like sometimes when we start talking about sacraments, there's just like a way in which a certain type of person is like, oh, we're sacramental. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm saying is sacraments, the genius of belonging to a sacramental church is that these are ways that God speaks into our lives, which have nothing to do with our own cleverness and have only minimally to do with our own faithfulness. But they are God's gifts to us, and we encounter God's gifts again and again and again. And they provide kind of a regulative function. For me, one of the most important ideas I encountered as a young preacher was the idea of preaching with the table in mind. And to sort of say, when I'm preaching, this is a good place for me to be fully me, for people to see. Phillips Brooks has this phrase that preaching is truth through personality. And he doesn't mean like woohoo personality. He means like God is seen working through the life and experience and voice of a human being. So preaching can be that way, but I also come to the table, and when I'm at the table, there's nothing that I'm doing that's distinct from what any other minister of the gospel would do, right? I'm bringing people to the table of grace, and I'm not saying Mike does this in a special way. I do feel like Mike preaches in a way that's uniquely Mike, but I don't feel like Mike does the sacraments in a way that's uniquely Mike. And that's good. People get to see me engaged as me, but they also get to see me saying, you know what, I'm leading us together into God's presence. And so sacraments kind of help tone down and give us appropriate ways of expressing ourselves without needing to be kind of leaning on our personality to get us through communion. So this provides a deep connection, especially for people who just find it hard to have that emotional gear that evangelical worship sometimes presupposes, right? Like for people who just can't quite get the fuss of what it feels like when they're singing, or can't even really get into a certain kind of sermon, the sacraments show them that God is for them too, and not just for the extroverts who are sort of masterful in those situations. So that's all I got for now. I'm hoping it turns into a pretty good book in the next little bit, but I'd love to, Joel, I don't know, do you want to kind of moderate questions here? I haven't really kept an eye on things. So do you want to take over from here and I can kind of respond? Does that work?
That'd be great. Yeah. Wow, man, that's incredible information, Dr. Jordan. Thank you so much. I can't wait to go back and watch this again. I'm jotting down notes as fast as I can. And I mean, I just got to tell, I mean, you are so right. I mean, I'm 54, so I'm just a little bit older than you are. But, you know, my generation, anxiety, you know, is perceived as a weakness. I mean, you just didn't share it. You don't share it. You have anxiety. It's a weakness. So thank you so much. I mean, that was very healing for me and very honest information just in the last 45 minutes. I can't wait to get your book. Quite honestly.
Yeah, that's all just a question float across. So like I say, the hope is early 24. That's when we're hoping for the book.
Okay.
So if I get especially inspired this summer, it might come out earlier than that, but that's what we're hoping for. So
wow. Yeah. Oh yeah. I just see that now. Yeah. When the book, and Mark Jalacueur just said the last bit about the sacraments is golden. Amen.
Oh, thanks, Mark. That's kind of you. Thank you.
Oh, that's incredible. So thank you so much. Yeah, we've got several questions coming in through the Q&A, and then we also have some through the chat as well. And we want to, like I said, we'll be very respectful of your time here, but it's one question from Emily Allen. It says, it seems like a lot of the solutions you raise bring us outside of ourselves to an awareness of what God is doing and what others are doing. How would you say that this helps us to know ourselves better as well? In terms of the overlap with mental health, do I understand myself only or best in the context of knowing God and others?
Yeah, Emily, thanks for asking that. Emily is a rising star who's going to be amazing whatever church she's in, and so thankful for her listening in. I feel like there's several ways to answer this question. I'm enough of an extrovert that I spent a great deal of my life finding myself through others. And I continue to feel like that's a gift of mine, right? Is that I do understand myself well as a preacher only when I'm preaching and hearing responses from people. One of the ways that I have really grown in the last decade, and one of the ways that I continue to need to grow, but I'm growing in those directions, is understanding the role of solitude in all of this, right? And that as I remove myself from other people and discover myself without their feedback about who I am, positive or negative. But I am not, Reverend Dr. Dean Michael Jordan. I am Mike before God, and loved as Mike before God. That's a crucial part of this too, right? And so Henry Nouwen, again, who I just deeply love, borderline venerate, right? He always talked about healthy communities as being communities that protected people's solitude. He said, there are communities that don't want people to go off and be by themselves. They don't want others to experience solitude because they know intuitively that if they go into solitude, they're going to start doubting the preacher. They're going to start doubting the community. And I experience a little of that, right? Like, I work with 18 to 22-year-olds. I know that frankly, probably some of the stuff I say sounds absurd to them. Like I get that. But it's painful to acknowledge to myself, right? And there's part of me that wants to just like continue to arrest their attention so that they pay attention to me. But I can't do that, right? Like ultimately I've got to recognize we are on our own before God. And for them to develop a healthy sense of who they are means they need that time with God too, even if it means that they might draw some misconceptions about who I am along the way. It just is. So yeah, I appreciate it, Emily. I think, I continue to feel like God's given me the kind of extroversion eyes, and I always want to, even these kinds of situations, I learn a little bit more about who I am as I present this material to people who are hearing it for the first time. And I never want to resist those messages, but I don't want them to be totalizing either. So thank you, Emily.
Great, thank you. Kind of to piggyback onto that, I've got a question that came in through the chat that said, I've been a pastor for several years now, but have found it very difficult to establish a consistent Sabbath experience. What would you suggest as best practices for me to establish a consistent Sabbath experience?
I think the first thing I would say would be just to use whatever's in your hands. That is to say, if you feel like it's too big a sell to your church to have a day off where they really can't contact you, then don't try to conquer that mountain before you start doing the things that you can do. So, often when I'm talking with students, we talk about taking time every day, every week, and every year to have some kind of solitude time. And so if your church isn't at the place where they're going to let you do that every week or every year, think about how you're doing it every day. Where are the snippets of time that you're grabbing? If you have 20 minutes between meetings, can it become time that is genuine Sabbath for you? I think I'd start there, I think. Church life is sometimes demoralizing that way because it's hard for people to get there. And we recognize that they may not fully get it, and that's okay. They're works in progress just like we are, but to use what we can, to take the little snippets that we can, I think would be what I'd encourage.
Thank you. Got another question here through the Q&A forum. How important are the emotions in the worship service?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So I love the idea of emotions in worship. And it's interesting, right? Like if you're all familiar with the liturgical studies kind of world, right? When I went to grad school, it was dominated by Episcopalians, Catholics. There were a few of us evangelical Christians, notably a friend of mine, Melanie Ross, who's a liturgical scholar at Yale, one of the very few evangelicals doing liturgical studies, but that they would very often, the Episcopal Catholic kind of establishment in the liturgical studies world really, I don't want to say hates emotions, but really it became this kind of like very snobby, classist, kind of like, we're not emotional quite like that. Our worship services are reserved. They're very, I don't want to say intellectual, but they're bookish, those sorts of things. And, for me, I continue to be just convinced that when God reaches into our lives, there's an emotional component to that. I think for me, the real test always is, has worship enabled me not just to shape like an emotional moment, but has it shaped my intuitions? Has it shaped my dispositions? So that when I leave a worship service, it's genuinely as I emotionally feel and intuitively feel that God goes with me into whatever challenging situation I'm going to. And for some people, those kind of ecstatic emotional encounters are going to be part of it because that's who they are. And they really will leave those things feeling like, yeah, I know God is real now, and I'm ready to go exhibit the fruit of the Spirit in every way I talk about him and the way I talk with other people. For others, though, it's going to be like, that ecstatic encounter is good for a place, but I'm going to leave here and find myself acting in ways that are radically incongruous with the Spirit of God. And so that for me is the real test of the matter. You know, I think there's a huge emotional component, but it can't just be located in that ecstatic encounter. So.
Great. All right, another question here. Do you perceive a higher level of anxiety post-COVID? I don't know that we're completely post-COVID yet, but as we're hopefully getting in that direction, but do you perceive anxiety, a higher level of anxiety from the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's a great, I mean, and that really is a good, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a good example, a good exhibit A of the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? So at Houghton, and I'm sure this is the case at the other Wesleyan colleges too, right? You have young people who for between 10 and 15% of their lives have been wearing masks and who have been reminded by powerful people that they are threats to others. And I get that. Please don't hear me saying like, that was horrible, we never should have been masking. No, that's not what I'm saying. I understand why it was done and support in many ways what had to happen. But we are dealing with the thick of people sort of being repeatedly told that they primarily are threats to other people. And what that looks like for me, right, is some young people at Houghton were just so thrilled to remove masks as soon as they possibly could and would actively work against masking policy. But some want to keep them on for a while, right? And because they have learned, frankly, if you want to put it crassly, they've learned that good guys wear masks, right? That's been the messaging. Yep. And they've been high achievers, they've been good kids, and they want to keep being good kids. And one of the ways they do that is wearing their mask, right? And so, you know, to put to the test the kind of thing I'm talking about, a healthy church or a healthy worshiping community doesn't try to resolve that for the sake of the leadership in the community. It doesn't say, I'm going to subtly make you uncomfortable for the choices you're making about a mask so that you'll take it off for my benefit. It really trusts these people are all on a journey together, right? And I get that God is working at you at a different speed than he's working with me. And while you need to be masked, you can be masked in my presence. I'll also tell you honestly what I think about the choices I make. And so, you know, we can be fully human with each other right now. But yes, I do think there's increased anxiety, and it's not something that we should be trying to solve quickly, because I don't think it will help everybody to just do whatever we can to make it go away. So, yeah.
Well, Dr. Jordan, I can't thank you enough for your time today. I can just feel your enthusiasm and your passion for this topic just coming through the screen. And I know, I mean, those that are watching are feeling the same. So thank you so much for the time that you spent and the time that you're going to spend in this project.
Sure, yeah, my great privilege. And like I say, I know there may be questions out there we didn't get to. If you want to reach out, like I'm really glad to talk. So just michael.jordan@houghton.edu. We'd love to carry on a conversation with any of you about this project or about what's going on in your own churches. Like I love this work, so we'd be glad to talk more.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, sir. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for those of you who are watching today and those who are watching the recording. Yeah, absolutely. We hope that you found this information very, very helpful. And as Dr. Jordan has so graciously offered, please reach out to him, or you can send it to me and I'll forward it to him if you have any further questions. Again, if you're thinking about seminary, you have some questions, we'd love to chat with you at 877-673-0009. And thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming today. And we want to wish you well with the rest of your day. Hope you have a great rest of your day. And remember, we are Wesley and you belong here. Blessings. Thank you.